Good day, everyone. We are Group 3, and today we are going to discuss enterprise risk management.
Hi everyone, I am Melchi Petrocorta and I will be reporting about the introduction and objectives of risk management. So in order for us to understand risk management, first we have to define risk. Risk is a probable impact of an action. It is a situation that involves a possibility of loss or injury. So it involves uncertainty about the effect of an activity, often focusing on undesirable consequences. Risk has two components. First, it has a probability of adverse impact of an action. This pertains to the likelihood of an event occurring, and second, its impact of resource losses, which pertains to the extent the enterprise is affected by the event. These two factors are taken together in assessing risk. The probability factor is due to uncertainty of operation of the threat. So an enterprise may have internal and external threats. Internal threats are threats that begin within a company. For example, stock out of critical spares. This is a potential internal threat for the enterprise, since if the part is not available when required, it may result in loss of production. And another example is labor unrest. This is also a potential internal threat since the dissatisfaction of the employees, which may be in a form of strikes, can disrupt the normal business operations. On the other hand, external threats are threats from outside the company. An example is changes in demand. Customers change what they're looking for with increasing unpredictability, and this is a threat for the company. Another example is changes in regulations. New or changing regulations could hurt the company and may cost them more money. Hence, it is an external threat to the company. Another threat is competition. Competitors may decrease the company's unique value on the market, thus being a threat to the business. So there are strategies for managing risk. It involves analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of a company, or what we call the SWOT analysis. Through the analysis, we develop scenarios or options for achieving the objectives. Then, the best option or the optimum approach for managing the risk is selected. In such selection, the cost of not taking the risk are evaluated against the benefits of taking the risk. Risk can also be managed through one of the alternative strategies. First, we have risk avoidance. Risk avoidance is not performing any activity that may carry risk. For instance, you avoid sailing in rough weather to avoid damages. Another alternative is risk minimization. Risk minimization is the process of doing everything possible to reduce the probability or impact of risk towards zero. For example, fire prevention arrangement. This could be one of the strategies to reduce the probability or impact of fire. Another alternative strategy is risk sharing. Risk sharing means sharing with another party the burden of loss or the benefit of gain from a risk and the measures to reduce a risk. Examples are limited liability companies, diversification, and outsourcing. And the most common example is insurance. In here, the entity's potential loss from an adverse outcome is shifted to a third party. And to compensate the third party for bearing the risk, the entity will generally provide the third party with periodic payments. So another alternative strategy is risk-bearing. Risk-bearing is having responsibility for accepting losses if projects go wrong. For instance, accepting risk with preparations for contingencies. Because entrepreneurs do not know for certain what the future holds, they are forced to guess what the most likely outcome of any decision will be and to estimate the likelihood of future events occurring. He cannot guarantee success, and neither can he insure against the risk of failure. But bearing risk gives rise to profit, and it is a reward for successfully taking risk. So among the alternative strategies, only risk-bearing gives rise to profits, while the other alternative strategies mitigate losses. So in order for companies to eliminate or reduce the impact of risk, companies must manage them. So what is risk management? Risk management is the process of measuring or assessing risk and developing strategies to manage it. It is a systematic approach in identifying, analyzing, and controlling areas or events with a potential for causing unwanted change. It is through risk management that risks to a specific program are assessed and systematically managed to reduce risk to an acceptable level. Basically, it is the act or practice of controlling risk. So, risk management is a systematic approach to setting the best course of action under uncertainty by first identifying the risk that the business is exposed to in its operating environment. There are many different types of risk, which will be discussed later on, and it is important to identify as many of these risks as possible. Second, now that we have a list of potential or existing risk, it is time to assess the likelihood of the event happening and its level of impact. Then third, understanding the risk. It is important to understand the link between the risk and different factors within the organization. To determine the severity and seriousness of the risk, it is necessary to see how many business functions the risk affects. And fourth is acting on the risk. In here, it is time to create or begin to implement a process to reduce the impact of each risk and a response plan for it happens. And its status and effectiveness should be monitored and reviewed. Lastly, communicating the risk issues. You need to document and share the progress of the risk management plan as it helps keeps the stakeholders engaged in mitigating risk. So, integrated risk management is a continuous, proactive, and systematic process to understand, manage, and communicate risk from an organization-wide perspective. So, it is about making strategic decisions that contribute to the achievement of an organization's overall corporate objectives. So, we note that risk management is first and foremost a science and then an art. So, why is this? So, risk management is a science because one needs to have reliable financial models, the best analytical tools, and the accurate and relevant data in managing the risk. And then it is an art because the entrepreneurs also needs their expertise and intuition and his holistic view of the organization to manage those risks. Now, we will talk about the objectives of risk management. So the first objective is anticipating the uncertainty and the degree of uncertainty of the events not happening the way they are planned. Risk management focuses on identifying what could go wrong and evaluating which risk should be dealt with and implementing strategies to deal with those risks. It expects the unexpected events to eliminate or minimize the impact of the occurrences that may have a negative effect on the business. Then the next objective is channelizing events to happen the way they are planned. Risk management also aims to make sure that the uncertainty is eliminated or reduced so that the events will happen according to plan. It helps you to identify and address the risk facing your business, and in doing so, it will increase the likelihood of successfully achieving your business objectives. The next objective of risk management is setting right at the earliest opportunity deviations from plans whenever they occur. Risk management tells you how you're going to handle risk in your business. It involves developing risk handling options to control the impact of risk. So whenever deviations from plans arise, they are corrected as soon as possible to reduce its negative impact. Next objective is ensuring that the objective of the planned event is achieved by alternative means when the means chosen proves wrong. Risk management ensures that when deviations from the plan occur, the corrections made are the best options to achieve business goals successfully. And the last objective is, in case the expected event is frustrated, making the damage minimal. If the planned occurrence does not occur, risk management aims to minimize the damage in this situation. So by implementing risk management, the enterprise can save resources and protect their future. This is because risk management helps the enterprise to avoid potential risk, minimize their impact, and cope with the results. This will enable the organizations to be more confident in their business decisions.
Good day everyone, I am Kate Varel along with Jorinella and Marinella, and we will define risk and discuss the different types of risk. So, what is risk? According to Dowd in 2005, risk refers to the chance of financial losses due to random changes in underlying risk factors. So basically, a risk is a random event that may possibly occur, and if it did occur, it would have a negative impact on the goals of the organization. It is the probability of incurring loss due to the unexpected and unfavorable movement of certain parameters. Risk has three elements, namely the scenario, the probability of occurrence, and the size of its impact if it did occur. Volatility is how risk is measured. Volatility is how fast or rapidly and unpredictably things changes. So, the higher the volatility, the riskier it is. In the corporate world, accepting risk is necessary to obtain a competitive advantage and to generate profit because, as a general rule, the higher the risk is, the higher the potential returns will be. Risk can be classified into different types. Some of these risks are: first is political risk. It is defined as the possibility of a multinational company being significantly affected by political events in a host country or a change in the political relationships between a host country and one or more other countries. Political risk is the unwanted consequences of political activities that will have an effect on the value of the firm. If a multinational company wants to make a direct foreign investment, they must assess the political risk before they make the investment. Next is country risk. This risk is defined as the exposure to a loss in offshore lending caused by events in a particular country, which, at least to some extent, is under the control of the government, but definitely not under the control of private enterprise or individual. Country risk is a broad concept. This encompasses risks such as sovereign, political, as well as economic, social, and external risk. Thus, country risk is the sum total of a number of different types of risk. Next is economic risk. It is concerned with the general economic climate within the country. Economic risk refers to the likelihood that conditions in the whole economy or macroeconomic conditions may affect an investment or a company's prospect domestically or abroad. Some of the factors which reflect the economic climate of a country are: level of affluence enjoyed by the country, the growth rate of income, the nation's propensity to save or invest, the stability of prices, the characteristics of the labor force, and many more. Next is social risk. This refers to the possibilities of loss due to factors such as religious fanaticism, ethnic polarization, dissatisfaction among the people as a result of the wide disparity in income distribution, or regionalism. These sociological problems eventually lead to riots and revolutions, resulting in the loss of lives and property. An economy plagued by riots and revolutions will undoubtedly face problems in repaying its debts. Next is external risk. The external risk component of a country arises due to situations outside the country. For instance, if the borrower nation is located beside a country that is at war, the country risk ratios of the prospective borrower will be higher compared to the case if its neighbor is at peace. Although the borrower nation may not be directly involved in the conflict, the chance of spillover may exist. Next is exchange risk. This risk is when the exchange rate fluctuates widely with the passage of time. So the borrower is subject to exposure to exchange rate fluctuations on the outstanding principal of the foreign currency financing. This risk is sometimes referred to as foreign exchange risk or currency risk. This is a financial risk that exists when a financial transaction is denominated by a currency other than the domestic currency of the organization. So in simple terms, this risk refers to the losses that international financial transaction may incur due to currency fluctuations. Next is business risk. This risk is determined by how it invests its funds, which is the type of project it undertakes. It is the exposure an organization has to factors that will lower its profits or lead it to fail. Anything that threatens a company's ability to achieve its financial goals is considered a business risk.
So next is the financial risk. This is the type of risk connected with a company's capital structure, where a company with no debt has no financial risk. The degree of financial risk is also determined by the capital structure's leverage, with a highly geared corporation facing issues such as high cost of equity and debt funds, cash flow challenges in servicing debt commitments, and the like. And then we have systematic risk. This risk is the portion of total risk that causes individual stock prices to fluctuate due to changes in the general stock market index. This also refers to the portion of return volatility caused by factors that impact all securities prices. When the stock market is bullish, all stocks have a rising trend, while in a bearish market, all stocks have a dropping trend. Because systematic risk is linked to economic patterns that influence the entire market, it cannot be avoided. In addition to the previously described systematic risk, there is also an unsystematic risk. This is the percentage of overall risk that is caused by known and controlled factors. Unsystematic risks are those that are unique to a single firm. As a result, a downward trend in one company's performance can be offset by an uptrend in another. Hence, unlike systematic risk, this risk can be eliminated or lowered by portfolio diversification. Then we have the market risk. Changes in demand and supply, investors' expectations, risk perception, and other factors all contribute to this risk. Market risk are price fluctuations triggered by real-world social, political, and economic events. Next, we have the interest rate risk. Interest rate risk refers to the unpredictability of future market values and the magnitude of future incomes induced by changes in the general level of interest. In general, changes in the rate of interest have an inverse relationship with the price of securities. Then we have the purchasing power risk. Inflationary risk refers to the uncertainty in buying power. Inflationary pricing risk will result in a rise in a production cost and a decrease in profit due to weaker margins. With changes in purchasing power, the expectations of investors will shift as well. Next, we have the default risk. This risk comes as a result of failure to meet financial obligations when they are due. The danger of insolvency and bankruptcy charges will rise if interest and principal payments are not made on time. This danger will result in a sharp drop in the stock price of the company. And then, the liquidity risk. Assets are disposed of with tremendous difficulty and expense in terms of both money and time. Liquid assets are those that can be acquired and sold quickly. The failure to turn assets into cash without sacrificing capital or revenue is known as liquidity risk.
Next is callability risk. This is a type of risk wherein that portion of the security's total variability of returns that derives from the possibility that the issue may be called or redeemed before maturity. This risk charges a risk premium but comes in the form of a slightly higher average rate of return. So as the risk increases, the risk premium increases as well. On the other hand, convertibility risk is a risk that arises from the probability that the investment may be converted into the issuer's common stock at a time that may harm the investor's best interest. Next is industry risk. This refers to the risks that are caused by the events or issues that affect the products and firms that make up the industry life cycle, international tariffs, and or quotas on the product produced by an industry that the company belongs to. Another risk is currency risk. This denotes the risk that is faced by the company that operates in different countries in regard to unpredictable gains or losses due to currency fluctuations or changes in the value of one currency in relation to another currency. Lastly, operational risk. This is a risk of loss resulting from the deviation from planned normal functioning system, procedures, technology, human failure, omission or commission of errors. It also arises due to inadequate or failed internal processes, people, controls, systems, or from external events that may adversely affect the revenue of the organization.
Hello, I'm Tanya Pegaro and I will be reporting Part C, which is about risk measurement and risk pooling. So let's first identify what risk measurement is. Risk measurement is an evaluation of the likelihood and extent or magnitude of a risk. It is a real valued function numerically representing an individual decision maker's risk ordering on a given set of alternatives. But why is risk measurement important? It is because it allows companies to prioritize and easily compare risks on many different levels and note declines or improvement on either their overall situations or specific problem spots. So the first risk measurement is risk pooling, which is mostly practiced by insurance companies. Like what the name suggests, under this system, insurance companies come together to form a pool which can provide protection to insurance companies against catastrophic risks. This type of concept is important to supply chain management. To further explain the concept, let me present an example. ABC Company has three branches located in Mandaue, Cebu, and Talisay. Each branch is required to keep safety stocks in cases of high demand where each one would need to pay warehouse costs and face different risks in doing so. Like what if there is an excess safety stock because demand doesn't increase, risk of pests, etc. This is where risk pooling comes into play. Instead of each branch paying for those costs and facing those risks, they centralize their stock in one warehouse, for example, in Cebu, which lessens their costs and risk of spoilage. Thus, critical point number one. A centralized inventory saves safety stock and average inventory in the system. Through a centralized system, when demands from the branches are negatively correlated, for example, Cebu branch has a higher demand compared to the Mandaue branch, they can offset each other as seen in the red line in the graph. Here, instead of Cebu branch experiencing shortage of stocks during high demand, the excess stocks from Mandaue branch can offset such demand. Thus, critical point number two. When demands from markets are negatively correlated, the higher the coefficient of variation, which is the ratio of the standard deviation to the mean, the greater the benefit obtained from the centralized systems. Thus, the greater benefit from risk pooling. But what happens when they are positively correlated? So when demand from both markets is more or less than the average demand, we say that the demand from the markets are positively correlated. As seen in the graph, instead of Mandaue having low demands, it has more or less the same demand with Cebu. Hence, instead of offsetting each other, they now have higher chances of shortage of stocks. Thus, critical point number three. The benefits derived from risk pooling decreases as the correlation between the demands from two markets becomes more positive. The basis for the concept of risk pooling is to share or reduce risks that no single member could absorb on their own. Hence, risk pooling reduces a person or a firm's exposure to financial loss by spreading the risk among many members or companies. Actuarial concepts used in risk pooling include A. Statistical variation, where variability is reduced through aggregation. Here, demand variability is reduced if one aggregates demand across locations because as demand is aggregated across different locations, it becomes more likely that high demand from one customer will be offset by low demand from another. B. The law of averages. The commonly held belief that a particular outcome or event will, over certain periods of time, occur at a frequency that is similar to its probability. C. The law of large numbers, which proposes that when the sample of observation increases, variation around the mean observation declines. In other words, the average value gains predictive power. D. The laws of probability. It is a statistical method used to predict the likelihood of a future outcome. This method is used by insurance companies as a basis for crafting a policy or arriving at a premium rate.
Hello, my name is Joyce Garganera and I'm going to discuss about diversification. So one way to reduce risk is through diversification. The saying, do not put your eggs in one basket applies to investing too. Investors should have a well-diversified portfolio. So a diversified portfolio contains a mix of distinct asset types and investment vehicles in an attempt at limiting exposure at any single asset or risk. So this would achieve the maximum return for a given level of risk or minimize risk for a given level of return. Portfolio holdings can be diversified across asset classes and within those asset classes, and also can be diversified geographically. So, diversifying geographically can be done by investing in both domestic and foreign markets. So, first, we have diversification by asset classes. Fund managers and investors often diversify their investments across asset classes and determine what percentages of the portfolio to allocate to each. So classes can include stocks. So stocks are shares or equity in a publicly traded company. Classes can also include bonds. So these are government and corporate fixed income debt instruments. Classes can also include real estate. So this include land, buildings, natural resources, agriculture, livestock, and water and mineral deposits. Classes can also include exchange traded funds. So this is a marketable basket of securities that follow an index sector or commodities. Assets can also include commodities, so these are basic goods necessary for the production of other products or services. And finally, classes can also include cash and short-term cash equivalents. So these include treasury bills, certificates of deposit, money market vehicles, and other short-term low-risk investments. So as mentioned earlier, diversification can also be done through foreign diversification. So investors can reap further diversification benefits by investing in foreign securities because they tend to be lessly correlated with domestic ones. So more on correlation will be discussed in a bit. So for example, forces depressing the US economy may not affect Japan's economy in the same way. So holding Japanese stocks gives an investor a small amount of protection against losses during an American economic downturn. To create a diversified portfolio, correlation must be understood. Correlation is a statistical measure that indicates the relationship, if any, between a series of numbers representing anything from cash flows to test data. So first, the two series is positively correlated if they move together. On the other hand, the series is negatively correlated if it moves in opposite directions. It is rare to have perfectly correlated projects. So when it comes to investing, the projects that should be added to one's existing portfolio are those that are negatively correlated with existing projects already in the portfolio. So doing this, the project risk would be diversified and the overall risk of the firm would be reduced.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Rose G. Villanova, and I'll be the one to continue the discussion of risk reduction through diversification. As previously mentioned by Ms. Garganera, using negatively correlated projects helps to reduce the overall volatility of the portfolio. And again, when two variables have a negative correlation, they have an inverse relationship. Inverse relationship means that as one variable increases, the other one decreases, and vice versa. So here on the left side of this slide, two projects are separated. The graph of project A goes up, and the graph which is the other graph, which is project B, goes down. So both projects move in opposite direction from each other, or in other words, they are negatively correlated. So on the right side, the negative correlated projects, which is A and B, are combined. As shown in the graph, project A and B have the same expected return E, also has the return E, so less variability of return. Thus, less risk than either of the projects taken separately. So to better understand these graphs, I'll give an example. Let's say in project B, a portfolio manager invests in stocks in the oil sector. However, over the past 4 months, oil stocks have been declining due to oversupply of crude oil, so which caused prices to fall, let's say, by 50%. Again, sa project B, the manager invests stocks in the oil sector. However, ni-decline ang stocks due to oversupply of crude oil, which then caused prices to fall. So the manager believes that oil prices will continue to fall and may even crash in the short term. So since short term na siya, the manager still wants to own the stocks for long-term investing. So here, negative correlation can be used to diversify the oil sector portfolio and reduce risk. So to reduce risk, the manager may look to sell a portion of his investment in the oil sector and then buy stocks to different sectors that are negatively correlated with the oil sector. So let's say there has been a strong inverse relationship or negative correlation between oil prices and airline index. So now the manager may buy stocks in the airline sector which are negatively correlated with the oil sector or project B. So pairing these negatively correlated projects diversifies a portfolio and smooths out ups and down or volatility in the portfolio returns. Next, the creation of a portfolio by combining two perfectly correlated projects cannot reduce the portfolio's overall risk. Again, combining two perfectly correlated projects cannot reduce the portfolio's overall risk. So if two correlated projects means that they move in the same direction. Let's say if the stock price of project A goes up, the stock price of project B will also rise. So this scenario is good. But what if both stocks decrease? So this will be a high risk. So for instance, loss from investment. So it cannot reduce the portfolio's overall risk. So while combining two perfectly negatively correlated projects can reduce the portfolio's total risk. Again, combining two perfectly negatively correlated projects can reduce the portfolio's total risk. So, as I've mentioned earlier, sa example nako about the oil sector and the airline, both of them are negatively correlated or move in the same directions. So even if the stock price of the oil sector continues to fall, some parts of the portfolio are still increasing. You still have a return from the airline investment. Next, correlation, a measure of the relationship between two data series runs from -1 to +1. So a measure of +1 indicates perfect correlation or two variables moves in tandem, while -1 indicates exactly negative correlation or two variables move in opposite direction. And lastly, a zero correlation exists when there is no relationship between two variables. So on the next slide, we will talk about the benefits of diversification. So first, it minimizes the risk of loss to the overall portfolio. So owning investments across different funds ensures that industry specific and enterprise specific risks are low. So if one investment performs poorly over a certain period, other investments may perform better over that same period. So this will reduce the potential losses of your investment portfolio from concentrating all your capital under one type of investment. Thus, it reduces risk and generates higher returns in the long run. So this is the second benefit. It enhances risk adjusted return. So in addition to limiting downside risk, a a diversification also have the effect of maximizing portfolio returns in the long run. So this is in part because risk is limited. So by avoiding exposure to major losses, the portfolio can be more likely to make money. So when evaluating the return of a portfolio, it isn't enough to simply look at the final number. Just as important is the need to look at the risks it took to get that return. So diversification exposes you to more opportunities for return because sometimes investment don't always perform as expected. So by diversifying, you're not merely relying upon one source for income.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Arnella Faye Lungay, and I will discuss the total loss distribution of risk measurement. As Melchi mentioned a while ago, we already know that one of the components of risk is its impact of resource losses. Once the risks are identified, probability distribution tools are utilized to estimate the financial impact of each risk. These are used to measure the expected frequency with which losses occur and/or the severity of losses. In risk management, there are two types of probability distribution used, namely empirical probability distribution, which is also known as experimental probability distribution. In this type, it illustrates the likelihood of the event occurring based on historical data. In a business setting, the risk manager actually observes the events that occur. On the other hand, theoretical probability distribution, a mathematical formula is used. Three of the theoretical probability distributions that are commonly used in risk management are binomial distribution, which evaluates the probability of an event occurring several times over a given number of trials, and given the event's probability in each trial. Next is normal distribution. It is sometimes called the bell curve. It is a distribution that occurs naturally in many situations. This distribution is symmetric. Lastly, Poisson distribution. This is often useful in estimating the number of occurrences within a specified period of time.
Ruin theory, or also known as collective risk theory, was developed by the insurance industry where it uses mathematical models to explain an insurer's vulnerability to insolvency or ruin. Normally, insurer's surplus is computed as the net cash inflow of premium income collected continuously at the rate of C and cash outflow due to a series of insurance claims that are mutually independent and identically distributed with a common distribution function. In this slide, we see two formulas to get the insurer surplus. First, the equation shown in the left side is the main formula to get the insurer surplus. The insurer's surplus is x plus ct minus the sum of y sub I as I goes from 0 to nt. C is the premiums arrived at a constant rate from customers, t is time, and n sub t is the number of claims received according to the Poisson process with the intensity function and are independent and identically distributed non-negative random variables y sub I. The main objective of this model is to investigate the probability that the insurer's surplus level eventually falls below zero. The equation on the right side is the expected discounted penalty function, which was made by Garber and Shu, used to analyze the behavior of the insurer's surplus derived from the probability of ultimate ruin. It is equal to e to the power of x times e to the power of negative delta t times k sub t. Delta is the discounting force of interest, k is the general penalty function representing the economic cost of the insurer, and the expectation relates to the probability measures. The theory of the probability of ruin is used in the case of risk of insolvency of a company with diversified business activity. They try to predict how much risk is being exposed to the company in order to find ways to minimize it. The way they do it is they involve actuarial calculations in the determination of the ultimate ruin by utilizing the formulas given.
Good afternoon. I am Aryan Gabor. Along with Edward and Chiki, we will discuss risk analysis, risk mapping, and risk indicators. Let us start by defining what risk analysis is. Risk analysis is a procedure to identify threats and vulnerabilities, analyze them to ascertain the exposures, and highlight how the impact can be eliminated or reduced. In other words, risk analysis is the study of the underlying uncertainty of a given course of action and refers to the uncertainty of forecasted cash flow streams, the variance of portfolio or stock returns, the probability of a project's success or failure, and possible future economic states. Risk analysts often work in tandem with forecasting professionals to minimize future negative unforeseen effects. All firms and individuals face certain risks. Without risk, rewards are less likely. The problem is that too much risk can lead to failure. Risk analysis allows a balance to be struck between taking risks and reducing them. Risk mapping is the first step in operational risk measurement, since it first requires identifying all potential risks to which the bank is exposed, and then pointing out those on which attention and monitoring should be focused given their current or potential future relevance for the bank. While the risk mapping process is sometimes identified with the usual classification of operational risks in a simple frequency or severity matrix, what is really needed is to map banks' internal processes in order to understand what could go wrong, where, and why, to set the basis for assessing potential frequency and the severity of potential operational events, and to define a set of indicators that can anticipate problems based on the evolution of the external and internal environments. Careful risk mapping is as important as a first step for operational risk measurement as it is for the audit process, when potential pitfalls have to be identified in advance and properly eliminated, or at least monitored. Key risk indicators come out as the result of the mapping process and should be used to provide anticipatory signals that can be useful for both operational risk prevention and measurement. Later on, Chiki will discuss more about key risk indicators. So what is another definition of risk aside from what Melchi said a while ago? Risks are unanticipated events that may affect the organization's ability to meet its key objectives. These could consist of unfavorable situations or missed opportunities. As such, a clear and effective understanding of the major risks is a key driver for organizational success. Risk mapping process is the process of identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing the risks that may interfere with the achievement of your organizational objectives. Its aim is to arrive at a clear set of action plans that improve risk management controls. in areas where these are necessary and help the management of the organization's direct resources. Later on, Edward will thoroughly discuss the risk mapping process. Moving on, we define what a risk map is. A risk map is a graphical depiction of a select number of companies' risks designed to first illustrate the impact or significance of risk on one axis, second, the likelihood or frequency on the other axis. Many types and variations of risk maps exist. For example, the axes can vary, the scales can vary, and some are even three-dimensional. The example in this slide illustrates a typical risk map. This risk map depicts likelihood or frequency on the vertical axis and impact or significance on the horizontal axis. In this configuration, similar to that of a mathematical distribution curve, likelihood increases as you move up the vertical axis, and impact increases from left to right. The points in the profile represent risks that have been categorized into 4 impact categories and 6 likelihood categories. The categories simplify the prioritization process by forcing placement of each risk into a particular box, showing its position relative to the others. The step line is the critical issue tolerance boundary. Scenarios or risks above this boundary are considered intolerable and require immediate attention, while risks below the boundary do not require immediate attention. In the next slide, Edward will discuss the risk mapping process.
Now, we already learned that risk map is a graphical depiction of a selected number of companies' risks designed to illustrate the impact or significance of risk on one axis and the likelihood or frequency on the other. The risk mapping process is part of a systematic, comprehensive methodology to identify, prioritize, and quantify risk at the macro level to an organization. This is an example of a risk mapping profile as shown a while ago by Aryan. On the next slides, we will be discussing an example of the risk mapping process taken from the Zurich IC2 profiling process, a methodology that entails a facilitation session and application of proprietary software to capture information. In the risk mapping process of Zurich IC2, operational risks are classified as 1. We have the people's risks, such as human errors, accidents, and personal injuries and fraud. 2. We have the process risk, such as faulty business process, incorrect working methods. The third one, we have relationship risk, which includes loopholes in contracts causing disputes or damages, statutory violations entailing penalties. We also have technology risk, which includes absolute plant, unreliable machineries, software bugs or virus. And the last one, we have external risks, which are disaster, riots, war, and etc. Now, it is possible for any of the said risks to migrate into one another. In capturing this information, we will be using different methods which include structured interviews, written and electronic surveys, or a combination of this. Take note that individual client characteristics and needs dictate the appropriate method of the data collection. We will describe the facilitation of the risk profiling process by highlighting the major elements. This includes the workshop, the scope, the team composition, the time horizon, the scenario development and categorization, the tolerance boundary, the profile development, the action plan, the process and technology transfer, and last one, we have the quantification and modeling. The first one, we have the workshop. Now, the profiling process of a risk mapping entails a highly interactive workshop, which one or two train facilitators to guide them throughout the process. In most cases, the role of the facilitator is not that of a functional or content expert, but that of the process manager, keeping the team on track and goal-oriented. In certain cases, where specific expertise is required, functional or subject matter experts can supplement the team. The second one, we have the scope, but let's skip first this one because we will be discussing it thoroughly on later on the next slides. Now, the third one, we have the team composition. Now, the team composition of an organization's team is critical to the success of the profiling process. The team should consist of senior level specialists and management staffs who possesses the experience, expertise, and institutional knowledge necessary to perform a thorough analysis of the process or areas addressed in the process. Now, most teams contain 6 to 10 individuals. Take note that the scope of the risk profile should determine who comprises the team. Then, we also have the time horizon, and then we have the scenario development and categorization. Throughout the facilitation process, the team undertakes controlled brainstorming to identify potential risks. Once identified, risks or scenarios are thoroughly discussed to gain consensus and development written descriptions of the scenarios. Each scenario is comprised of a vulnerability, a trigger, and a consequence. Now, next one, another major element is the tolerance boundary. Now, this is a step line on the profile wherein you separate those risks that are currently tolerable and those that are intolerable. Then we have the profile development. The final step in developing the profile is the placement of the business risk into the risk map based on their impact and likelihood categorization. As what you have seen a while ago in the example of a risk profile, the 1 to 6 points shown in the graph are the business risk. Now, it is important to note that the ultimate value of the risk profile does not rely in determining the precise impact or likelihood level of a particular threat, but it is the placement of that threat relative to the placement of other threats that determines its value. And then we have the action plan. Now, it is important to develop specific action plans to reduce either the potential impact or likelihood or both. The team also develops success measurements, target completion dates, and assign responsibilities for each action to team members. The purpose of the action plan is to move each intolerable risk above the tolerance boundary line into the tolerable zone. And then we have the process and technology transfer. Upon completion of the risk mapping or profiling exercise, it is important that the process and technology be integrated into the firm's operations. This would allow updates and future profiling to be performed by the company's management. The last one, we have quantification and modeling. The degree of detail necessary to analyze a particular risk varies from one risk to the next. If a team consensus can be achieved, then significant details is not required. Some business risks and action plan will require more details, examination, and quantification than can be achieved in the profiling facilitation workshop. Profiling acts as a filtering mechanism to determine which risk, if any, requires special or detailed quantification. However, experience demonstrates that the vast majority of risks and action plans can be successfully addressed within the workshop's allotted time. For risks requiring additional analysis, we utilize sophisticated quantification and modeling techniques. Now, the scope is the most important element in the facilitation of risk profiling process. In the process, the scope of the exercise is determined at the beginning of the analysis to specify the areas of the business considered. This is because the scope provides the parameters for the analysis. The scope is often defined as identifying, prioritizing, and understanding risk and impediments to achieving corporate and strategic objectives. The scope can be as broad or as narrow as desired. However, a balance exists between the breadth of the scope and the evaluation of information derived from the risk mapping process. For example, the value of one risk map for a multi-billion-dollar firm would be significantly less than one risk map for each division or business unit of that company. In addition to identifying a company's showstopper risk, there are numerous benefits to risk mapping. On a standalone basis, the risk profile is an effective communication tool, particularly for members of senior management and board members. As the old expression goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. The risk map prioritizes risks by their placement on the profile and reveals which threats require management's time and company resources. This may entail reallocation of time and resources from controlled threats to those that require immediate attention. Different mapping techniques, depending on the methodology, have varying benefits. Now, these are some of the benefits of the risk mapping. One, it promotes awareness of significant risks through priority ranking, facilitating the efficient planning of resources. We also have, it enables the delivery of solutions and services across the entire risk management value chain. We also have it serves as a powerful aid to strategic business planning, and we also have aids the development of an action plan for the effective management of significant risk. Aside from those benefits, we also have it assigns clear responsibilities to individuals for the management of a particular risk areas. Risk mapping also provides an opportunity to leverage risk management as a competitive advantage. It also facilitates the development of a strategic approach to insurance program design. And lastly, that it supports the design of a client's risk financing and insurance programs through the development of effective or optimal retention levels and scope of coverage, etc.
Good day, I am Chiki Singkulan and I will continue to discuss a bit of risk mapping to relate to my main topic, key risk indicators. So risk mapping starts from process mapping, which is a planning and management tool that visually describes the flow of work. Starting with this figure, let's assume that phase 1 and phase 2 are part of the flow of work in a process map. In each process phase, critical risks such as staff turnover, number of errors, and other risks should be identified, which then can be linked either to key people, to systems, to interdependencies with external players, or to any other resource involved in the process. The risks identified are things that could possibly slow down the organization's process and cause missed deadlines. So let's say the bank has an issue with employee wages leading to high staff turnover. This means that there is a high number of employees leaving the company. Or let's say there were many customer complaints as bank employees kept on making errors in recording their balances. So these items are considered critical risks as these affects the day-to-day operations of the bank. Subsequently, these potential effects of errors, failures, or improper behavior are analyzed in order to identify priorities in terms of control actions. So let's say that after the analysis, it was identified that there is a high risk exposure due to system failure. So this risk becomes a key risk indicator as it is exposed to higher risk compared to other risks, and of course, special care and prioritization should be given to these high severity risks even if they appear unlikely to occur. So from the figure, we can see that the key risk indicators, which were the staff turnover, number of errors, and system failure, come out as the result of the mapping process. They are considered critical predictors of unfavorable events that can adversely impact organizations and should be used to provide anticipatory signals that can be useful for both operational risk prevention and measurement. In short, they are an indicator or a metric used to assess and measure a possible risk. A simple way to think about the KRI is to consider it like you do an alarm. If something is heading down the path of a disaster, you will be made aware of it by taking measurements of a KRI rather than waiting for negative outcomes to occur. For a manufacturing enterprise, it may assess risk of operational losses by reviewing its competitiveness in regard to technology, competitor strengths, production capacity, etc. The key risk indicators here should build up early signals of deficiencies in order to avoid crisis and mitigate problems. Such KRIs in a manufacturing enterprise include market performance, customers' feedback or complaints, and competitors' performance, orders in hand and inventory, input-output performance, cycle times, suppliers' performance, plant utilization, cost per unit of product or service, and financial ratios. But when can we say that a KRI is effective? First, when it is measurable, wherein metrics are quantifiable just like what we've enumerated earlier. However, it is also important to not ignore relevant qualitative information. If possible, develop a way to categorize and scale this type of information so you can measure and report it. Next, it should be predictable or it should provide an early warning signal. Next, it should be comparable. meaning you can track it over a period of time or with the use of trends. Lastly, it should be informational where you can measure the status of the risk and control. As what Aryan said earlier, it is really needed to map a bank's internal process in order to understand what could go wrong, where, and why. To do that, building internal loss data plays a major role to better capture risk trends and the effect of internal risk reduction efforts. It can also be used as a check for internal self-assessment. However, there are many decisions to be taken when building such a database, especially for banks. First, the definition of the operational events. As far as it is concerned, the bank should decide whether to adopt a stricter definition of operational losses or whether also to record other kinds of events that might be relevant for internal risk management purposes. One example of an event would be credit losses deriving from operational errors. Because under Basel, which is a set of internal banking regulations put forth by the Basel Committee, credit losses are already taken into consideration under credit risk, which is why this is to be excluded from operation risk losses to prevent double counting. There's also this issue of near misses, which are events or failures that occurred without incurring operational losses, though it might have provoked a loss even if they did not. So it is kind of like a lesson to improve, as this could provide further data about what could have happened and can be used to signal business line managers of a potential risk. A bank may adopt a broader definition of this operational event than Basel suggests. Second, the minimum threshold of loss to be recorded. A loss below the threshold will not be captured, but loss above it will be captured. Imagine if we set the threshold too high, only a relatively limited number of medium to high impact events would be recorded, which could mean that there is a weaker base for estimating the frequency and severity of all operational events. On the other hand, setting a lower threshold would allow a good base for estimates because a lot of losses are recorded. The downside to this is it comes with higher collection costs as it requires greater effort to enforce the rules. Third, the loss classification criteria, which is apparently strictly dictated by the Basel Committee, which requires one to map events based on both the 8 main business lines and 7 categories of events, but then we won't dwell on this. So, fourth, how losses should be recorded. Fifth, the architecture of the loss collection process should also be defined through assigning proper responsibilities for the detection, collection, quantification, and data quality control of any event. Lastly, the final point that the bank should consider are the policies concerning operational events' internal disclosure. Even if it is often kept confidential, periodic feedback must be given to business unit leaders to help them perceive both the potential impact and benefits they can derive from more careful monitoring of operational risk events. So that's all for our report. Thank you for listening.